I'm starting to sense something in the waters regarding Liam Lawson and another Red Bull power struggle. And how I think instead of him being the next Verstappen, he might end up being the next Tsunoda or Gasly. And yes, it might have something to do with how Christian Horner and Helmut Marko are arguing with one another as to who might be leading Red Bull into the future. Same old, same old. Now, if you're thinking that I don't want Liam Lawson to get to Red Bull, you would be wrong. After all this time, all the chances Liam has had to show what he can do, he's done a really good job at proving his case. He's surely done enough to warrant a couple of years in F1 at least, to establish a push toward the senior team. You know, to either be alongside Max Verstappen for a year or two before Max moves on with his life, or essentially, if things go the way they are right now regarding the FIA and Max, maybe even Liam being the top banana. But I'm getting a really big sinking feeling that after all of the stuff that's happened with Christian Horner this year, that he might end up having more power than ever at Red Bull, and he would want to exert it. And that might be actually prioritizing one of his own candidates in the Red Bull Junior team over the preferences of Helmut Marko, that being Liam Lawson, his biggest champion, and maybe even Isaac Hadjar. Oh, come on, Law, you're always cynical when it comes to these things. Surely Christian Horner's not going to prefer someone else within the Red Bull Junior team over Lawson. He's been one of their champions and main reps for so long. Surely there can't be anyone else. Well, I thought that too, until recently it's become quite clear who Christian Horner has in mind, and if you're from outside the UK, you're probably going to be groaning, as it could mean that we might have more than a quarter of the grid represented by a Brit. And this has been going back months apparently, and this is all surrounding another Red Bull Junior driver, not George Russell, as Horner's also been talking about the last couple of days, and Toto Wolff reckons he's just trying to cause trouble. Now, I will admit, Toto does have a point there. He does tend to flirt with the idea of talking with other drivers when they're doing particularly well, or if they might be available in the not-too-distant future. You remember when Carlos Sainz won the Australian Grand Prix? Christian was entertaining the idea about, well, Carlos is available, you never know. However, the main concern I have is to do with the aftermath of Daniel Ricciardo no longer being a Red Bull racing driver of any kind, not even at VCARB, and the ambiguous send-off that he had during the Singapore Grand Prix. The logical belief is that Liam Lawson will be stepping in from Austin onwards to replace him, and thusly the line of succession of Red Bull could actually continue, or at least start. And with Daniel Ricciardo no longer wanting to accept the role as a reserve driver, it's either a main time racer or not at all, it's been expected that Liam Lawson would take over the role for maybe the rest of this year and then go into 2025 as a full-time driver alongside Yuki Tsunoda. You know, after we get back from a few weeks break and we get 2 triple headers with a 3-week break in between. Seriously, what is wrong with this year's calendar? It's completely disjointed. There are so many awkward breaks, seriously. However, there was a comment from Horner that I spotted on Racing News 365's piece when Horner was poking the big bad wolf regarding George Russell. And the sub-headline was my main point of interest, not the stuff with George. And it was to do with another Red Bull Junior, and how the team principal is not all that hyped regarding Lawson's impending redeployment at the sister team. These days, I'm not taking any of his opinions regarding outsider drivers seriously, because now he's talking about poaching Oscar Piastri from McLaren. Whilst at the same time, McLaren poached their head of race strategy, Will Courtney, from them, and he's going to start in 2026. Oh! However, I'm more attuned to the takes of the Red Bull Junior team that he has, now that it's been concentrated a little more. Although having said that, they've now actually taken on 7 new recruits this year alone, so it's now the Red Bull Junior team consisting of 15 drivers. So naturally, there is going to be a huge selection going forward, especially in the next 2 years or so, but Liam Lawson is not his main bet anymore, and in the last few months, it's mostly been F3's Arvid Lindblad. And this is the comments that Christian Horner has mentioned, which really got me inspired to make this video, so ahem. We're having to look further down the road. We've got some great talent. We've got Liam Lawson on the bench. We're not quite sure, looking at the likes of Franco Colapintoand Oliver Bearman and Kimi Antonelli, is he at that level? Only time will tell. We've got Isaac Hadjar in Formula 2, who's been, until recently, leading that championship. We've got a very exciting young talent that I'm particularly excited about in F3, Arvid Lindblad. So we've got depth in our junior program, and that's why there's a natural point in time. We've got a gap now, but we just want to take time to consider what do these options look like for the future. Now, in his defense, Christian isn't wrong. The top of the Red Bull Junior tree ladder right now does look quite promising, almost spoilt the choice even. But that might be a problem in of itself, and it might mean that there might be another bottleneck in the making if Max Verstappen doesn't go anywhere. If they get it right, then fantastic, they're back in the game. If they don't get it right, then they might have wasted 2 years of their time backing the wrong horse, and then the person that they might have done better with might be on with another team, or might be out of motorsport entirely, because it's mainly driven by money, and if they don't have any money, as we saw with Zach O'Sullivan, you're out the door. And also, is to respond to the current trend in F1 right now, which I am so thankful exists, is that F1 teams are now starting to actually look at rookies and go, hey, they might actually be pretty good. Maybe we should actually take a punt and risk something with them. They might turn out to be really good. So instead of having to rely on established drivers who are marketable, profitable, and well-known and popular, they can now actually take a risk with younger drivers, and if they do well and they make a name for themselves, they actually get the benefits of the more experienced drivers. So there you go. Look at what Franco's been able to do in 3 races. Look what Oliver's been able to do in just a couple. Although at the same time, Sauber might be playing chicken because, according to certain rumours, they might be giving Bottas a 1-year contract extension instead of taking a punt on Bortoleto or Colapinto, when no other self-respecting top-tier driver would even give Sauber a second look. As Horner points out, Antonelli and Bearman are the 2 linchpins of both Ferrari and Mercedes, and their desire to nurture a future Max Verstappen is very, very important to them. Bringing them into F1 before they turn 20 will allow them to find their feet and make mistakes, which Verstappen himself encourages Antonelli specifically to do. Well, I mean, I guess that would explain his crash in Monza. If he doesn't have to feel awkward about making crashes, I guess Kimi took Max's advice to heart. Now, whilst it's not a guarantee that Bearman or Antonelli will be able to achieve half of the things that Max Verstappen has been able to do, it's still a really good sign that Ferrari and Mercedes, albeit with Haas's help, are willing to take a gamble. And in fact, you could even include Lando Norris in there as well, as McLaren took the punt with him back in 2019 when he was 19, at a time when McLaren really had nothing to lose, but it proved to be a worthwhile investment. So naturally, Red Bull and Christian Horner might want to take a look at their own pool, see who might be a diamond in the rough who's currently in their teams, and might be having the potential to strike it lucky and have plenty of time to find their feet and really grow into the role, like Max Verstappen did at the tender age of 16, and especially if McLaren work it out with Sauber and send off 19-year-old Bortoleto to work with them on loan. Which is why I reckon Red Bull are now torn as to what to do, and it might lead to that potential struggle really rearing its ugly head again between the advisor and the boss. Who might that person be, their young vassal? Might it be Liam Lawson after all? Or might he be something different, like just a typical Oscar Piastri, someone in his early 20s, not necessarily a greenhorn, but essentially established? Or might it be one of the 2 younger candidates who are below 20 that are in F2 and F3? Well, I mean, Lindblad will be in F2 next year. And that's going to be very important because next year, if things go currently the way they are, we might have 2 major Red Bull juniors at the same F2 team. That is going to be really good in comparing apples to apples. Granted, Isaac Hadjar is 19 and he would fit the bill right now since he's doing well in the championship. If Red Bull wanted to have a youngster to respond to the other teams, he has shown promise and garnered praise amongst the entire Red Bull family, even Horner. But there is a really key differentiator between himself, Antonelli and Bearman: his temper. Now, I know you might be thinking that that's a cheap shot, that that's not fair. But we need to have a look at what Horner's experienced with Yuki Tsunoda when he was in his formative years at the beginning of his tenure at Red Bull. Absolutely, Tsunoda has improved. He's managed to dial it down. Great for him. But those first couple of years, whilst it might have been endearing at the beginning, it did start to grate in 2022, and people were calling for him to be removed. Would Christian Horner want that same thing to happen again with somebody who might not be able to control his mood? He needs to find somebody who is the complete package and also willing to be a team player and is relatively calm, which is the case for Antonelli and Bearman. And it really didn't help matters that when given an FP1 slot in Silverstone this year, Hadjar was the slowest of the rookies, given a drive, as well as banking the least amount of laps, which were not enough for him to bank that bonus super license point, which rookies receive for driving over 100 kilometers in an FP1 session with no penalties or incidents. Incidentally, Colapinto and Doohan, who also took part in that FP1 session, were faster in slower cars, by the way. They crossed over that 100-kilometer threshold with no problems at all. And oh yeah, Hadjar almost collided with Norris at turn 3. So he made a name for himself for all the wrong reasons, and yeah, that's not necessarily a good sign in his first time out. Now, forgive me for being harsh, but you've also got to take a look at what happened at that weekend at the same time in F3. Arvid Lindblad absolutely decimated the field, winning both the sprint and the feature race. That definitely caught many people's attention, especially given the fact that the weather was absolutely atrocious. And now Lindblad's destined to possibly be Hadjar's teammate at Campos Racing next year. That is, if Isaac doesn't win the title this year. So, that's gonna be spicy, so watch that. But back to Lawson. Why am I concerned? Well, it's all to do with that quote again from Horner, and how the team boss of Red Bull Racing seems to be quite doubtful of the Kiwi without being disparaging. Essentially, Horner's just leaving Lawson's destiny to fate, to see what happens, just see where the chips fall or something like that. Whereas Arvid Lindblad, at the age of 17, he is Horner's new hotness there, and I know that sounds awkward, but that is reality. It's almost as obsessive as what Toto has with Antonelli. And just watch in 2025. If Lindblad storms the field in F2 and does really, really well, we will never hear Christian stop talking about Arvid. And he might have won the F3 title ahead of Leo Fornaroli had he not had a really bad run of performances in the last 3 races, and he admits that it was a real bad stinker. But in the eyes of Horner, that didn't really matter. He'd already done enough to impress him and proclaim him as one of the brightest that we have in the junior program. Now that's a ringing endorsement when you consider that Lawson and Hadjar are there as well as Iwasa, poor Ayumu, in Super Formula. Now, to be fair, it's not like Horner's not praised Isaac Hadjar at all. He has actually mentioned his outstanding talent and how he was actually congratulating him for leading the F2 championship for the long time, so he wasn't completely dismissing Isaac. But when you consider what Arvid's doing in F3 right now, and where F1's going right now with all of these young rookies who are barely outside of being able to get a driver's license, that's where everything's going. That's where the puck is headed. So Red Bull doesn't want to be left behind. And it's really not helped the situation that this sort of situation that they have with Liam Lawson is not necessarily a smooth and harmonious introduction into Formula One. It's more like Marko and Horner are over a barrel. They have to use Liam Lawson or else they will lose him. All of those hours in the simulator and in old Red Bull cars getting up to speed, the millions of dollars of investment like Alpine sunk into Oscar Piastri and then they let him slip through their fingers, they don't want Red Bull the same thing to happen. So they have to use Liam Lawson, and if Marko, what he said is true, then they are contractually obliged to give him some running in 2024 as well. And he says, oh, Liam has a seat for next year. So maybe Horner is somewhat reluctant and it's like, well, we've got to run Liam. He does show promise, but we're not necessarily pinning all of our hopes for the future on the kid. So already it's really impeding what Isaac Hadjar can do, considering that Checo's pretty much safe for next year at Red Bull, Yuki's already locked in, Liam has to be in the car. If Isaac does win the F2 title, he's only going to be a reserve driver. He's only going to be doing FP1 sessions. That's not ideal. It'd almost be worthwhile for him to lose the title, have one more year in F2, and then see what happens in 2026. But maybe there could be a difference here. Maybe Horner might take a punt and drop Checo for 2025 and put Liam Lawson in the car alongside Verstappen? Ha! You really think that they're going to poke the beehive that is Max Verstappen at the moment, considering that he is on a really short fuse at the moment, what with the FIA, the car not performing as intended, him actually having to look over his shoulder and think, wow, Lando's actually quite close behind. The only way I can see Lawson getting into Red Bull right now, given that Checo might be safe for 2 more years, is if Verstappen bails the team or F1 entirely. For now though, contractually, that isn't happening until 2028, 2029 technically. So the way it's going to pan out really is that next year it's Tsunoda and Lawson at VCARB, and then the following year it might be Liam Lawson leading VCARB with maybe Hadjar or Lindblad in that seat next to him, because Tsunoda, we don't know what's going to happen to him. Might be called up to Red Bull, we don't know. But the main thing that people are thinking is that he's going to wind up as Aston Martin's reserve driver since Honda's moving over to them, and that mainly they kept Tsunoda around longer than possible and originally intended due to the fact that Honda and Red Bull had that close network, then they won't have it anymore, so Horner will have no more use for Yuki, so why should he be there in Milton Keynes anymore? There are a lot of permutations at play, and none of them I think are really all that great for Liam right now, and as a result, that might mean he might get the short end of the stick here, that he might end up being the next Pierre Gasly or Yuki Tsunoda. Not dismissed from the Red Bull program per se, but essentially just given the role as being the bastion of the sister team, the constant, the stability and continuity, as is the maxim of Christian Horner. He would be the one that the Faenza-based operation looks up to be the person to guide them, the person who's had experience with them before, and therefore will stay there for the next 2, 3, 4 years and just help give them some clarity and a bit of a yardstick toward all the other Red Bull juniors that might get the leap over him. Now, would Lawson take this? Probably not. He might tolerate it for a couple of years, but if he's not going to get his way, he's going to be out the door faster than Pierre was. But to be fair, if VCARB turns out to be almost as good as Red Bull in 2026, say the senior team doesn't get the formula right and then Verstappen's floundering somewhere in the middle of the top 10, and we might see a situation like in 2008 when Toro Rosso and Red Bull were not so different in terms of result. Red Bull started off the season stronger, and then Toro Rosso ended the season stronger, what with that run of form that Sebastian Vettel had, which peaked in Monza with his surprise victory in the rain. But given that Antonelli and Bearman, especially the former, are being thrown a bone by their respective teams to find their feet from a relatively tender age, Horner might feel compelled to do the same thing in time for 2026 with Lindblad, should he perform well in F2 next year or even win the title. Like I said, it would help the team's boss's decision immensely if Hadjar stuck with Campos and be a yardstick for Lindblad. But it all really depends as to what happens in 2025 and then going into 2026. The complete hierarchy could utterly change, where Red Bull might be akin to where it was in 2014. It might not be the best anymore, so it might be able to afford to take risks with its driver lineup, like Mercedes is with Antonelli. They're looking at 4th place in the constructors, and Toto's just going, you know what, maybe we should take a risk with Kimi. We're not exactly going to be at the top of the constructors. We're not in some big battle or anything. We're just battling to even try and survive. But then you've got to think, if Antonelli turns out to be really good next year, maybe Horner might actually flip the switch and put Arvid Lindblad in the car next to Verstappen for 2026. Now that would be absolutely insane. It might be a gamble that Horner might be willing to play, and it would be completely flying over the heads of Hadjar and Lawson, and imagine the anger Liam would convey, because let's be real, in Drive to Survive, Liam did not hide his displeasure as to being snubbed over Ricciardo. And with Lawson aged 22, Horner might not be all that thrilled, given that those under 20 recently, they stunned their teams and us with their preparedness and completeness, especially Colapinto. And that also might be what holds up Hadjar as well. His hot-headedness might be exciting to watch, but when you look at Bearman and Antonelli, who are more measured in their conduct, it's quite stark. Horner is looking for a driver, a younger one at that, who has that complete package and can easily be molded into a driver that he ultimately would like. Notably, a very, 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 very loyal one who will not rock the boat. That's become very, very clear, what with Checo being given so many chances, more than the supposed cutthroatedness reputation that Red Bull has established since it entered in 2005. Now, look, ideally, I would want the situation to be that Tsunoda gets a call up to go with Verstappen or to lead the team going forward. Maybe Tsunoda Lawson come 2026 if Max decides to bail and Red Bull give up on Checo. That would be the dream. That would be the real realization of the Red Bull Junior program. 2 of their best drivers right at the top, doing what they can do. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be yet another example of a power play from Horner to install his preferred candidate over Marko's preferred candidate, which is Lawson and or Hadjar. And thanks to the doctor's mouth and handling of contracts up until recently being very, 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 very vocal, as noted in Marko's candid words regarding talks with Carlos Sainz, and how he was in charge of contracts before Horner stepped in to take over, Lawson has to race in 2025. So okay, Horner will let Marko have that one. Horner will not make that same mistake again and will keep Marko on a tight leash. And I seriously reckon that as a result of that, Horner will see no reason to look at Lawson and completely dismiss him from any discussions of either partnering up with Max in the future or replacing Max entirely and bringing up a completely brand new order in terms of Red Bull racing. And it just makes me think that maybe Lawson is just destined to be at VCARB almost forever until he gets bored and finds somewhere else. Hopefully he can do that and prove Christian wrong and go and find a really good job with another team. He is a really popular driver. He actually has been able to establish a fan base. He's done everything expected of him, and Red Bull have completely vacillated on the kid. Had he come in at the beginning of 2023 instead of Nick de Vries, one of Marko's biggest gaffes, picking a Mercedes guy over their own guy Liam or something, yeah, he was able to find his feet in Super Formula. That's fantastic, but maybe he might have been able to do the business somewhat better at AlphaTauri, where there would have been no pressure considering how bad the car was at the beginning of the year. Had he come in nearer the age of 20, it might have really established himself more in the eyes of Christian, and maybe we might be having discussions more realistically about him being one of the top guys. And also, a really interesting thought came to my mind, and it's making me think that maybe Christian Horner might get the upper hand over Marko, is that considering now the Red Bull Junior team consists of brand new hirings mostly, 7 out of the 15, Marko might be more focused on those and trying to find the next person that could easily go up to F3 or something like that, considering that some of them are in karting, some of them in a regional Formula 4 series. That might be a big enough project for Helmut to work on, and that means Christian can actually focus on his job that he is employed to do. And remember, Helmut Marko is not employed by Red Bull Racing, he is an advisor to Red Bull, the main company. So I think in 2025, Liam is going to be under absolute pressure to perform. He has to completely demolish Yuki Tsunoda, or else the people behind him, Isaac and Arvid, and maybe Oliver Goethe if he's able to step up because he's coming up to F2 as well, they will really be gunning for Liam's seat and long-term success with Red Bull maybe. If Red Bull turn out to be okay in 2026, the hierarchy changes, Verstappen doesn't like it, he goes to another team or bounces from Formula 1 altogether, the cork will have been popped, and all of these Red Bull juniors will be clamoring to outdo Liam Lawson, so he's got to do the business, seriously, if he wants to even be considered by Christian Horner. Because if he doesn't, he's just going to become a benchmark for said talent. But F1 might throw him a lifeline if Max Verstappen decides that he's had enough of the sport, given the FIA president's recent punishment aimed at him. To find out why the F1 community is totally up in arms regarding the situation between the FIA and Max, you should go and watch this video next. It's very spicy.